I would like to thank the European Educational Research Association for the kind invitation to give this keynote. It's a great pleasure to be here in Yerevan and to share with you some thoughts and ideas drawing on research that I have been involved in over recent years. As was mentioned already, the title of my talk is Teaching in a Change Scenario and the Role of Educational Research. Lessons learned and ways forward. So when planning this speech, I noticed, as already mentioned, that the theme of this year's conference focuses on change. It's about education in a changing world. And I remembered a sonnet by the great 16th century Portuguese national poet, Luís de Camões. Camões is the author of the epic poem Os Lusíadas, a masterpiece of Portuguese literature, which celebrates the seafaring exploits of the Portuguese explorers in the Age of Discovery. The sonnet I would like to talk to you about very briefly is also well known and talks about change. I am not going to read all the sonnet, but I would like just to read the first and the last stanzas. It says like this: the times go changing, fashions change, the ways of being change, all pretenses grow strange, the world is made up of worlds of change, invariably varying its face. And the last stanza: and yet, apart from these everyday changes, a single further change staggers me more. Things are not changing as they changed before. It's a poem translated by Flores. So as you can see, the poem focuses on change. It's a reflection on new directions and novelties, but also the passage of time. Nature is subject to change. People also change. Our interests and feelings change. Our ways of living change. Change is an ongoing process. You cannot control change. Change is different from what is expected, and the poet goes on to say that things are not changing as they used to. In other words, change itself is changing, is also changing. So I think the idea of change could be the motto of our reflection today. Teaching in the changed circumstances as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Overnight, the pandemic brought about changes in education and teachers' work with almost no preparation or previous reflection. All of a sudden, the teaching scenario had changed, and both teachers and students had to adapt quickly to the new reality. In this context, we might ask, how do we envisage change in the aftermath of the pandemic? Is there a before and after COVID-19? In terms of change within education generally, and in teaching and teachers' work in particular? If so, how can this change be characterized? How have teachers experienced it? What do they have to say about the ways in which the pandemic affected their work and their professionalism? What characterizes teaching in the post-COVID age? To what extent does it represent a reconfiguration of teaching and teachers' work? Although the pandemic was universal, we know that teachers and students did not experience it in the same way. Schools were closed and teachers had to operate in a new scenario under challenging circumstances, trying to reach out to their students and teach remotely. Some see this unprecedented, rapid and forced shift from face-to-face to remote teaching as an opportunity to reform education, or even a revolution that needs to be continued, especially when it comes to digitalization and the use of digital tools. Others, meanwhile, are more cautious and call into question its implications in terms of equity and social justice. Those who are already at a disadvantage, whether through lack of technology, the influence of poverty, or underserved schools, experience even more profound change. Clearly, issues of inequality and exclusion in education became more visible and were exacerbated during the pandemic. So, how should we look at change in this context? Are we dealing here with an impetus to transform practices, Or are we simply talking about an interruption to business as normal, which may have been a significant experience, but with limited effects on teaching practice and how teachers work after returning to their schools and their usual way of doing things? We know that the sudden and unexpected shift from face-to-face to remote teaching involved global and local responses to a scenario for which nobody was prepared. On a global scale, the disruptions to schools and to teachers' work are well documented in the media, and they draw attention to the new arrangements for school at home and to the scale and complexity of the impact of the pandemic on teaching and learning. According to the OECD, the COVID-19 crisis forced school closures in 180 countries, heavily disrupting the learning process of more than 1.7 billion children, teenagers, and their families. While there are many aspects to the impact of the pandemic on education and how teachers dealt with the experience, my focus today is on teachers and teachers' work. I will draw mainly on data from research conducted over the last 2 years through national surveys, narratives, focus groups, interviews with teachers. I will use extracts of teachers speaking in their own words, which powerfully illustrate some of the key issues. Teachers were challenged, like I said, to quickly respond to a sudden and mandatory transition to remote teaching. Hargreaves identifies in this context 4 pandemic changes that have affected the nature of teaching. Children were taken out of school to experience learning in some form or another from home. For shorter or longer periods of time, all students experienced learning remotely, and even when they got back to school, blended arrangements were often in place to deal with safety and health issues. The second change concerned the experience of lockdown from the teacher's point of view, as they were forced to teach in a virtual environment, which means that they had to develop digital competencies. Another issue relates to the profound changes in teachers' work when schools reopened under conditions of physical distancing. For instance, spending time enforcing mask wearing and sanitizing procedures, teaching students who were separate from each other, trying to sustain cooperative learning activities in physically distanced environments, and so on. Finally, teaching as a collaborative and social profession. As Hargreaves suggests, the work of teaching draws on the social and moral support of colleagues. During the pandemic, teachers were away from their routine conversations and interactions. However, teaching in a remote environment also had the potential to expand the ways that teachers interact with their colleagues through online networks, for instance. So, what do we know about teaching and teachers' work following the outbreak of the pandemic? I will try now to summarize key research findings, which I think may help us to reflect on its implications for teaching and learning. And I will do so using 3 main themes: adapting to the technological tools and digital platforms, the reconfiguration of teaching and learning, and the impact of the pandemic on the social professional dimension of teachers' work. In spring 2020, emergency remote teaching was rapidly put into place, but a number of problems were identified from the outset. Technical problems, lack of adequate equipment, and discrepancies in access to technological devices and to internet access were reported. Teachers talked about the initial shock and how they dealt with the unexpected closure of schools and the search for ways of reaching out to their students. As this teacher states, the first time was a moment of shock, and tried to do everything that was possible to keep in touch with my students, being there for them, supporting them and their families. I was not so worried with the content and the tasks. In his analysis of teachers' state of readiness to face the challenges of the COVID-19 lockdown, Schleichler concluded that teachers in most education systems covered by the PISA 2018 were unprepared for digital learning. Only younger teachers exposed to using technology during their formal preparation or employing it in teaching activities could be considered prepared for the pandemic requirements. In the 2018 survey, only 60% had benefited from professional development in ICT. Furthermore, a report by UNESCO, based on information from ministries of education in over 100 countries, also noted differences by country income level in their capacity to track student learning, improve connectivity, support teachers, and offer special training in ICT skills. Between 25% and 31% of low-income countries were not providing any of these necessary conditions for teaching in COVID-19 times. Media reports. Seems that is not working. So somehow it's not working, some problem maybe. I have tried and it was working. Sorry about that. Well, it should work. Well, I'll continue. So it was an interesting example about teacher struggles. So media reports and articles in the literature have given a clear picture of the lack of essential tools needed to successfully engage in the new mode of teaching. Here there was an example of a Portuguese teacher who had to find a quick solution to a lack of internet connectivity at home at the very beginning of the first lockdown. Half an hour before teaching, she had to go out and look for a place with a secure internet connection. And she ended up having to teach in the back of her car, where she improvised a classroom. She needed to find the best spot to be able to interact with her students, and then go back home to charge her mobile phone in order to teach in the afternoon. Her situation was eventually resolved, and she was able to teach from home. This example illustrates the struggles, but also the solutions that teachers came up with to deal with the challenges of working from home. The need to improvise the classroom in their homes and maintain contact with their students meant that teachers were forced to take up digital learning. At the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis, this involved them doing emergency remote teaching, but later it also led them to create appropriate online tools and resources, as well as develop a more planned pedagogical response. These quotes are illustrative of the efforts made by teachers who had to switch their mode of teaching without the necessary preparation. They also talk about the learning that came about in their experience. During the first lockdown, the focus was on changing everything from one day to the next, where we had to adapt overnight in order for students' learning to be affected as little as possible. In 2 weeks, I had to learn a lot about apps, none of whose name I knew, but which proved to be so useful that I intend to go on using them in my classroom teaching. Teachers recall a sense of discovering a new world as they became familiar with digital platforms and online educational tools. They also mention opportunities for professional development, especially in digital competencies. These involve courses and modules provided by the Ministry of Education, by their schools and teacher centers, and other institutions, but also informal learning and self-training. A large study conducted in Portugal indicated that only 14% of the teachers had prior experience of some sort of distance teaching, which was a key element in explaining a more positive adaptation to the new scenario imposed by the pandemic. Research has shown that teachers' lack of digital know-how and the absence of relevant professional development opportunities were key variables in explaining teachers' adaptation to distance teaching. Other research highlighted concerns about not being pedagogically prepared to teach remotely. Now, in 2022, almost every teacher has experience of working remotely. So the question is, what can we say about teaching? About how teaching has been reconfigured as a result of the experience of teaching during the pandemic. Teachers were expected to go on teaching in new scenarios and had to face new challenges regarding communication with students and to support their learning. When compared with in-person classroom teachers claim that their remote teaching has changed greatly or completely. Changing interaction patterns emerged as a key issue. Teachers had to reassemble their skills into new forms of teaching. Being aware of how effectively they could reach their students, they had to implement different communication skills. These ranged from physical delivery of learning materials or WhatsApp messages to students without online connection, to the use of teaching and learning platforms for online communication. The usual effectiveness of their working methods was challenged by concerns how to perform the ritual tasks of planning, communicating, and assessing the ways that would be meaningful and accessible to their students. Research points to difficulties in getting in touch with students and involving them in the activities, and also to the lack of interaction and spontaneity. Variations were found in the level of students' engagement depending on their socioeconomic background. In schools where pupils' socioeconomic background was low, teachers report lower levels of student participation and compliance with tasks and assignments, and lower levels of pupil satisfaction compared with teachers in schools with pupils from high socioeconomic backgrounds. What is clear from the data is the steep learning curve regarding the technicalities of using ICT in teaching and exploration, but also the exploration of new tools and platforms for online teaching, preparing materials, content approach, and pedagogical interaction and assessment. But there were also positive aspects, as this teacher illustrates. Online teaching was quite positive for more shy students because they had different opportunities to engage in tasks, which were not just about oral activities. In some cases, I think that students were a lot more engaged. Despite the difficulties, the need to change teaching strategies were assumed as something unavoidable. However, this process was neither easy nor linear. In some cases, teaching remotely led to adopting a more structured, step-by-step orientation so that students would not get lost. To quote from two teachers, online teaching somehow reduced the dialogical nature of my approach. And yet another one, I cannot get feedback from students regarding their understanding of the lesson contents. Also, it bothers me that the students always have their cameras turned off during classes. Assessment also became a critical issue in remote teaching. When compared with classroom teaching prior to the pandemic, teachers report providing feedback more frequently and giving more importance to formative assessment, while at the same time seeing a decrease in student participation. They highlight how they used new methods and did away with others normally used in the classroom, especially in a context where national exams were suspended during the pandemic, as was the case in Portugal. Teachers talk about a greater balance between summative and formative assessment, for example, through the implementation of feedback practices and mobilizing digital-ready formative assessments. In another study, teachers talk about making gains from the first to the second lockdown in terms of using digital tools more confidently, making tasks and materials more appropriate, using more online resources to teach, using pedagogical strategies in more innovative ways, using more appropriate methods for assessing students, and having a more balanced approach to when and how to give feedback to students. So teachers referred that there was also the possibility to transforming their practices, as this first teacher mentioned, because of the wearing of masks, because of they needed to circulate in the classroom, and she also mentions opportunities for proximity, monitoring, self-regulation, and self-evaluation. Teaching in a new scenario called into question how to maintain relationships and establish emotional connections with students, and how to sustain student engagement with learning. Some teachers had to teach in a way that was far removed from what they would normally consider doing, and how they would ideally like to teach. And so this had implications for teacher identity. The following teacher's testimony is very eloquent in this regard. I can't move my classroom strategies to the screen. Not losing interpersonal relationship was key, and it has marked my experience during lockdown. But it was terrible. I found myself crying sometimes, not in terms of despair, like I can't do it, or this is not working, but just because this is not me. This is not the relationship that I want to establish with my students. Teachers stress the value of face-to-face teaching, which they consider to be irreplaceable, even though they recognize the importance of digital learning. The lack of student feedback and the lack of student support together with tiredness, explain the more negative experience, as this teacher also states. Distance teaching was at a given moment a real nightmare. It was very tiring, and it brought me a sense of powerlessness, as I knew that only a few students were listening to me and were able to follow my teaching. I have learned to appreciate even more the importance of face-to-face contact with students and colleagues. So some teachers found themselves having to teach in ways that clashed with their professional values and beliefs, whether due to the inadequate conditions or lack of support, or due to difficulties in adapting to the new teaching scenario. Teachers' work and lives were therefore profoundly affected by the pandemic. And now I would like to move on to the last theme, the social professional dimension. Of course, if we look at the research, concerns about students' well-being and the level of learning, as well as their financial situation and of their families, was very much present in the teachers' accounts and in detriment of the concerns about their own financial, personal and professional situation. Being a teacher during the pandemic involved more intense work in direct contact with families in order to better support their students. Teachers talk about entering the student's home, and so they were able to learn more about their student situation and their families. Issues also include lack of time, difficulties in managing the various roles at home, alongside tiredness and fatigue, especially due to an increase in time devoted to preparation. I think this quote is very illustrative of some teachers' experience. From my experience, I have learned that working until physical and psychological exhaustion is not good. I used to work for 14 or 15 hours a day during the first lockdown, and this had consequences. Preparing synchronous and asynchronous lessons with tasks for 212 pupils, and also checking the tasks, led me to take medical leave for the first time in almost 30 years of teaching. For me, the problem was the countless hours of preparation. This perception can also be found in other literature. They report an increase in workload, stress, anxiety, and even burnout. So, a study carried out in Portugal also showed a decrease in teacher well-being, as well as lowering of their professional commitment and long-term perspectives. Teachers often mention how human and physical resources were mobilized and frequently they refer to the dynamics of collaboration and teamwork. They also mention the mobilization of endogenous resources. And when asked about what kind of support they received, they talk especially about their own contexts. They mention colleagues, tutors, those teachers responsible for a given group of students, leadership team, department year coordinators, the principal, and support team responsible for distance teaching in the school. Only 15% refer support from the Ministry of Education. Teachers talk about the difficulties faced, but also refer to the capacity of schools and teachers to reinvent themselves to meet the challenges of the new teaching scenario. And so teachers mentioned, like I said, collaboration, and this quote I think is illustrative of this. Teachers also have done more collaborative work, sharing. It wasn't like an obligation, but COVID has shown us the added value that sharing brings, even for those who are more skeptical. Collegiality and collaboration were therefore key, and Hargreave stresses, amongst other features, teachers' professional skills, especially pedagogical expertise, together with their professional capital, and in particular social capital in relation to how they share knowledge and ideas within collaborative cultures and professional networks. Let's try, if it is possible, to hear from one teacher. I think it's not available. I'm sorry about that. Let me see if I still have time. I think I'll try to end this presentation. Sorry about that, but I think I'll try to, if it works like this, I think it has to do with So this is the other video, so I'll show you now. The video that I was talking about, and then I'll come back to the presentation. Is it okay? So the teacher she hadn't internet connection at home, and she had to go and find a spot so that she could teach. And she had to improvise a classroom in the back of her car. So this is just an idea to illustrate the struggles and how teachers have dealt with the shift from face-to-face to remote teaching in the very beginning of the first lockdown. So I would like just to mention that that his teacher, I don't know if it was possible to read in the back, but the teacher was talking about teachers doing a lot, and the question is doing not enough or doing too much. And she mentions that schools cannot fail, and she could not fail to her students, and collaboration saved the teachers. So this testimony is eloquent of the struggles facing teachers and their responses to the new teaching scenario. Sorry about the technical issues. Teachers also, like I already said, emphasize endless hours devoted to preparation and to establish contact with students. For most teachers, the experience of teaching during the pandemic has highlighted the importance of the relational dimension of their work and their resilience and ability to adapt. To quote one teacher, I was impressed with my capacity for resilience and adaptation. This capacity was felt by the vast majority of my colleagues. The issue of emotions is also reiterated in teachers' accounts. As Harvey reminds us, teaching is an emotional practice, not just a cognitive intellectual one. And this quote is also very illustrative. When I said that sometimes I was in tears, it has to do with my not being able to sort out problems that were not my responsibility, but still I took them on. I saw many colleagues despairing in the sense that they were not able to respond to multiple situations. So there are, of course, lessons to be learned and implications that I would now like to try and sum up. A deeper analysis of the impact of the pandemic on education requires time in order to consider all its multiple strengths, but it's possible to identify some lessons learned. One key implication of the pandemic is a clear need to develop digital competencies in teacher education. It is, however, essential to move beyond a mere instrumental approach to technology and to consider its ethical, political, and pedagogical dimensions. Such a view needs to go beyond the consumerist and replicative logic, which may be marked by standardization of procedures and managerial control. If digitalization is without a doubt unavoidable, it is also true that technology is not a curriculum nor synonymous with curricular and pedagogical innovation. It is thus important that teacher education plays a part in building and supporting communities of learning by enhancing dynamics of research and encouraging the sharing and collaborative construction of knowledge. For example, consideration must be given to teachers' and students' roles and responsibilities in online educational experiences, including issues of power and control over teaching and learning. This means moving beyond the questions of what and how, and to consider why and who and for what purpose in order to transcend bureaucratic and managerial professionalism. There is a need to foster dimensions such as autonomy and commitment as part of occupational professionalism, self-efficacy perceptions, as well as feelings of being part of supporting learning communities. So the pandemic demanded an abrupt shift to remote teaching, and there are some lessons learned. So research has shown that teachers' responses were characterized by two different logics. On one hand, a logic of replication, suggesting that teachers try to replicate their face-to-face teaching in online environments, but without any kind of change, or with little change in their practices. And on the other hand, a logic of adaptation, which means that to a lesser or greater extent, teachers change their practices and strategies as a result of using digital tools and online environments in their teaching. We can therefore identify elements of both change and permanence in teachers' practice. As such, elements of a more transformational approach may be discussed, which includes not only changes in terms of tools and methods of teaching and assessment, but also the focus and purpose of teaching and of assessment, as well as the role of teachers and students in teaching and learning. It is important to explore whether teachers' experience is likely to be a catalyst for transforming their approaches and practices of teaching. in these post-pandemic times. Issues of diversity, differentiation, purpose, and the role of various stakeholders need to be considered. Thus, more needs to be done in regard to ensuring a more consistent transformation through, for instance, appropriate policies regarding teacher education and professional development. As I said, and the examples are very illustrative, from a state of confusion and anarchy, teachers and schools moved towards a rapid and positive response overall. However, a universal and inclusive response was not possible, despite teachers' best efforts. So there were clearly a number of complex problems requiring changes beyond the mere contingent response to the pandemic, and to consider both its primary and impact, but also the secondary or long-term effects. L'Oreal Billings argues that the challenge of the COVID-19 pandemic exposed several vulnerabilities affecting healthcare, the economy, climate, and educational disparities. And she advocates for the need to fundamentally rethink education and to consider the pandemic as an opportunity to restart or to reset education using a more robust, culturally centered pedagogy. The latest UNESCO report stresses that the pandemic served to prove our fragility and our interconnectedness. It then goes on to say that urgent action is needed to reimagine our futures, as well as the power of education to bring about profound changes. And one of the key proposals for renewing education in the report focuses on the teaching profession. Teaching should be professionalized as a collaborative endeavor, where teachers are recognized for their work as knowledge producers and key figures in educational and social transformation. This means that their autonomy and freedom must be supported, and that they must participate fully in public debates and dialogue on the future of education. In fact, what the pandemic has clearly shown is the essential importance of teachers and of teaching. Their work became more visible, and this experience represented an opportunity for teachers to develop digital competencies and adapt their usual way of teaching to a new scenario. However, if the response by schools and teachers to the unexpected and sudden transition from face-to-face to remote teaching was generally effective, it also revealed different paces and different processes of adaptation associated with different organizational dynamics and digitalization cultures. There were, of course, like I said, dynamics of collaboration and collegiality. And this is emphasized within a context of a perceived lack of support or clear guidance at the policy level, thus testing the capacity of schools and teachers to reinvent themselves to meet the challenges of the new environment. The translocation of teaching from a classroom setting to online platforms was an intense experience for teachers as they felt the initial shock, but also created an opportunity for them to collaborate. And this has been associated with teachers' sense of professionalism and the emergence of students. Discussing the losses, gains, and transformations related to changes in teachers' work as a result of COVID pandemic conditions, Harvard stresses the value of the expertise that teachers have gained and the value of social relations and in-person communication and collaboration among students and among teachers. And to quote from him, "We cannot serve our students by sacrificing our teachers. We must serve teachers well too. We must be more inclusive of teachers' professional judgments in every facet of policy making. And we must not squander the appetite for collaborative professionalism that teachers everywhere demonstrated when they faced the greatest crisis of their careers." It is clear that In the post-pandemic time, change will be a key feature of education. Change in terms of a greater use of technology, affecting both students and teachers, as they become more proficient in digital literacy. But it goes beyond that. There is a need to enhance flexible and innovative approaches to teaching and to develop creative pedagogies to foster student engagement. However, if change is a key word in thinking about the future of education in the post-COVID age, there are also elements of continuity. Sorry, I got lost. Such as the importance of in-person interactions and the place of professional values and pedagogical principles associated with dialogic, student-centered and flexible orientation to teaching. The value of face-to-face teaching has been strengthened and in a way revitalized, as teachers have made sense of their experience in a changed and changing scenario. The poet at the beginning talked about change and how change itself is changing. He also stressed new realities and how time and fashions also change. While it is important to investigate the short-term and also the long-term effects of the pandemic, attention also needs to be paid to issues that already existed before the pandemic and that still remain. As António Novoa, a very well-known Portuguese scholar, states, for an educationalist, each portion of hope needs to be balanced with a portion of skepticism, not cynically but critically. Fashion is the worst way to deal with educational issues because it entails magical solutions that are always false. They are false not because they are necessarily wrong, but because they dispense us from thinking. So if there are issues in the post-pandemic time, there are also issues that we need to consider and that already existed in pre-pandemic times, like the conditions for teaching and learning in schools and classrooms, the understanding and practice of teacher professionalism, in order to develop for collaborative professionalism. And also Darling and Ahmed and Heiler talk about investing in high-quality education preparation, transforming learning opportunities for professional educators to match current needs, supporting mentoring, and creating time for collaboration. So this is where educational research plays a pivotal role. As Mentor and Flores asked, I think it is important for us to reflect during this conference about who undertakes research and how. So the question in researching about teaching is who undertakes research into teaching and teacher education, and what is its nature? Is a broad range of research methodologies employed? Is there evidence of independence and criticality in the research undertaken? How is such research disseminated and made use of? These questions need further examination. And also, as Mentor argues, it is important to employ a wide range of disciplinary methods, not only the usual approach of educational research, but also comparative studies, political economy, historical and cultural analysis, geographical anthropological perspectives. One key issue that is needs further consideration is teacher professionalism. As Mentor and Flores highlight, questions of trust and agency are central to the nature of teacher professionalism in any context. The greater the degree of mutual trust and respect between policymakers, teachers and researchers, then the greater the level of self-determination and agency we may expect. And they identify forces for convergence and divergence in policy development. The former are related to the influence of OECD exercises such as PISA and TALIS, leading to international comparisons and to policies trying to emulate those systems that are more successful, but also to transnational agreements such as the Bologna process in Europe. As for the forces of divergence, they suggest issues of national identity, distinct approach to language and language education, cultural diversity, and citizenship education. And they go on to say that it is expected to see great variation between the approaches taken in different settings, relating to the national specificities of the context, including historical trajectories and distinctive cultural characteristics. They argue that it's through this kind of comparative analysis that we may come to understand better both our own approaches and the approaches taken by others. It is also important to stress the dynamic nature of teaching as a profession and of the interactions between research, policy, and practice. The year 2020 showed dramatically how events can change expectations and experiences, and how they impact teaching and teachers' work. Managing change and uncertainty was and still is a key concern for schools and teachers. It remains to be seen whether any substantive change is underway and how, or if a temporary and contingent solution with limited impact prevails and why. Schools and teachers continue to face varied challenges in a rapidly changing world. Whilst the pandemic has exposed the fragilities of education system, it has also provided an opportunity for professional learning and enabled the emergence of creative and contextualized responses that need to be continued. But for this to happen, it is necessary to go beyond contingent and temporary responses to a crisis in education, such as the one that COVID-19 pandemic imposed on teachers. It requires the consideration of what teachers have to say, their capacity for action, and the investment in policies of teacher education that are consistent with sophisticated and complex views of teaching and of teachers' individual and collective agency. Thank you very much. I'm sorry about the technical issue.
Yeah, thank you very much. Now we have about 7 minutes of questions and answers. So, who would like to pose a question or comment on what we just heard? Okay, you can try, but I also will maybe be assistant. So you will be second, then later.
Okay, so I'm first. That's good. Okay, so I'm Victoria Schwanley, and I'd like to ask you a question, if I may. I'll speak slowly, so at least it's not too difficult. I'm interested in two things, really. One, what about the students from marginalised groups, and how do teachers reach these students? Were there catch-up sessions to help these students? Because if we saw the videos which you showed and the struggles which the teachers had, I mean, what are the struggles of the students? How are you teaching? How are you reaching them? That's the first thing. The second point I wanted to mention is that, so in what ways have teachers developed to engage and connect with hard-to-reach students in order to diversify the curriculum? So there's two questions there. One is around marginalised groups and you know how they have actually experienced this and how the teachers engage with them. And the other one is around the diversification of the curriculum when you're delivering online teaching. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your questions. I have not done research with students, only students in higher education, but there is research also on students, and there have been some initiatives to try to meet the challenges, and especially the struggles and difficulties in marginalized or challenging student population. For instance, in Portugal, there's a plan for recovering loss. And do you want to say something? Yes. Okay. Yes. Yes, there is also research on that, and we also find that there were critical issues in relation to students in higher education. It was possible to identify different processes of adaptation related to the personal but also the contextual and institutional factors. We did not focus specially on students from, our sample was a national sample, so we did not specify some specific groups, but it was possible also to identify in terms of higher education some critical aspects, because sometimes you could think that the conditions would be different in higher education, but this is not true, even in terms of equipment or the required technological tools for teaching. And the other one is about curriculum, development of curriculum. So the curriculum, I can speak for my context, and it's important to state that there has been some initiatives, like I was saying, what we call a more flexible curriculum, and also a national plan for recovery of learning loss. Although it is also important to say that there have been challenges in how to respond to this kind of struggles and difficulties facing teachers and students in the post-pandemic age. Okay, thank you.
Have your question.
Thank you. I've been involved in training teachers for emergency remote teaching in my country, that's Switzerland, and I noticed a lot of differences depending on the school grade. Kindergarten, primary, secondary, lower secondary, higher secondary, and so on. And let's say vertically, but also horizontally. For example, rural versus urban schools, or big schools versus small schools, and so on. I was wondering if you had any insights in these variations.
Yes, I can give you some references, because we do also found some differences in terms of rural and urban contexts, but also in terms of levels of teaching, and even significant statistical differences in terms of career of the teachers, in terms of their responses to the struggles or the challenges of teaching online or teaching remotely. So yes, there were especially difficulties in preschool and primary school levels, and also, of course, significant statistical differences in terms of rural schools, because of the access to resources, different kinds of resources. But what is important to see is that overall there was a very good responses in terms of the mobilization of the associations, the entities, the agencies in the context to respond to the challenges of, for instance, students or pupils not having the required equipment to interact, for instance, with them through mobile phones, and in some cases through delivering material for students, because there was not a different way. But I can identify some references where you can find more details about this research. Thank you very much for your question.
Okay.
Do we have a time for one?
Yes,
Yeah.
one more
Thank you
question.
very much, Professor Maria, for your comprehensive overview and updating us about the pandemic situation in regard with teaching and teachers' life. Mine is a comment instead of a question. You don't necessarily need to answer. I was thinking that, as you said rightly and mentioned the quote that change is even changing, and we have learned lots of lessons from. You mentioned many of them in your presentation about what we have learned from pandemic. So I'm thinking that at a point where we are gathered as scholars, we need to think maybe how to prepare teachers for uncertainty and for another change. Next time it won't be pandemic, it would be another. So as you said, change is changing. So this time we learned lessons from pandemic. Technological skills, they are skills and that can be learned, but teachers' preparation for the uncertainty and for a future, upcoming future change, maybe we need to think about. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a good point. So there is much research, further research needs to be done, and there's a lot to explore and reflect throughout this conference. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. I think we leave more questions for the breaks and of course for the keynote panel on the 9th of September. And I would like to thank you very much. And this is a present right to gather things from all over Europe. Just little things to say thank you, and thank you very much also for your attendance and also for your questions and again for your keynote. And now we can look forward for the 30-minute coffee break. Okay.